Spread the fire. This is SMWX. I'm Tessa Dooms, and today I am joined by friends. Hello, friends. Hello. So we're going to be talking all things election process. Today is really about voter education, voter conversations, everything that the voter needs to know about the process of this election. And I know a lot of time is spent spoken about the parties and manifestos and who the candidates are and all sorts of things. But we also think it's really, really important that before you know who you vote for, that we all understand the process. I think in 2024, more than any other election, for me, I've been really worried that we need to actually believe in this process as we go into it. There's so many moving parts. There's new processes and new systems. And the good thing about our elections throughout our democracy now, 6 national elections in, is that I've never felt like we need to question the electoral process. We must watch it and we must always be observant. But I think that we've run credible elections for the last 30 years. And I'm very hopeful that this year won't be any different. But I think in order for that to be true, we must all have that sense that we know and understand the process. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So welcome, friends. Mbali, tell us who you are, the choir.
Thank you. So my name is Mbali Ntuli. I am the CEO and founder of the Groundwork Collective. It's a community initiative. For my sins, I was a politician for many years before that, as a councillor and then as an MPL for about 10 years. And now a lot of the work that we do is focused on me realizing that a lot of people didn't actually understand how government works, how the systems work. And I don't think you can have a functional democracy if you don't have active citizens. So a lot of the work that we do in our organization is to try and find ways to help people that are patriotic about the country actually understand where they can get involved, what they can do, even if it's just in their community, because this is the reason that we have the impunity of the politicians that we do. It's because we don't always hold them to account beyond voting. So we try to make that process a little bit easier. And so far it's been going well. But I mean, I'll tell you guys a little bit more about that later. But that's what I do now.
Cool. And you're part of the reason why we're here.
Yes. So obviously I saw that on Twitter, people were always asking the two of us similar questions. And so that's why I had sort of tweeted, hey guys, I think we should do a video and explain some of these things to people. And we only did it once. And so, yeah, I'm glad we'll find the time and we're all super busy.
Cool. And then the third part of the trio.
Hi, I am Sithembile Mbete. I am a doctor, Sithembile Mbete. I am a political scientist. I teach and do research at the University of Pretoria and the Department of Political Sciences there. And my teaching has been in South African politics primarily, as well as international relations. A lot of my research has been in the electoral system and political parties and political party politics generally. For my sins, I was on the Ministerial Advisory Committee on electoral reform. And that was a committee that was put together to advise government on how to implement the new nation judgment of 2020 that called for the inclusion of independent candidates into the national and provincial electoral system. And so, so that is me. And like Mbali says, really passionate about informing South Africans about the system. Democracy is it's not a spectator sport. It's a contact sport. You need to be on the field, whether you are participating as a player. Well, everyone's a player actually in democracy, but whether you are a political party or political candidate or a voter, you're all playing, and you all should be playing by the same rules. It's just that not everybody knows what the rules are. Yeah. And so I think a really an important thing that's emerged for this election because of the changes to the electoral system is how important it is to remind people or to teach people for the first time what the rules of the game actually are.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place for us to start, right? So the changes in this particular election.
Have you introduced yourself?
I'm Tessa Dooms. I'm Tessa Dooms, director of Rivonia Circle. and fanatically passionate about democratic participation. I've become more and more passionate over the years. But yeah, my 9 to 5 is voter participation, democratic participation, citizen participation in democracy. Yeah, so for me, why this is really, really important is just the basics of this election having changed. And I wanted to chat to you about that process of the change of that election law, because you were part of that in terms of the ministerial committee. So what we know as an outcome of that is that this year, for the first time, we'll have 3 ballots, all of us, when we go and vote in the national provincial election. So initially, there used to be 2 ballots, one for the National Assembly and one for provinces. And because of the way our system has been set up, it has been a party ballot only. And so only parties would appear on the national ballot, only parties would appear on the provincial ballot. Different provinces with different parties, but you had these 2 ballots. And so now we have 3 ballots. And the third ballot is the ballot where is a national ballot, number one. And I think that for me is also an important thing, because by having 3 ballots and having 2 national ballots, essentially what we're saying is that every one of us can vote twice for national parliament. We can vote for 2 parties or 2 persons or 2 entities to go into their National Assembly. So the party ballot, as we've always had it, will be there, and we can vote there for any party we want to have in the National Assembly for 200 seats. And then this regional ballot that will exist, which will be a regional to national ballot, which will have people who are standing as independent candidates on that ballot, but also parties on that ballot for the other 200 seats in Parliament. And then the third ballot is the provincial ballot, which will also have independent candidates for the first time for all of the seats in the different legislatures. So for me, that's the big change that I think every voter is going to be confronted with on that day, and that I hope no voter doesn't know about by the time they get there. But maybe talk us through how we got to the point of 3 ballots, and what are some of the things that we need to think about as we're making our choices on those 3 ballots. And what do we know to expect on those ballots? How did it get there? What does it all mean?
All right. So the Constitutional Court judgment was basically, or the case that the Con Court heard in 2019 and the judgment that we got in 2020 was about whether or not the Electoral Act of 1998 was constitutional because it required an individual to be a member of a political party in order to contest for a seat in the National Assembly or any of the provincial legislatures. The Electoral Act had codified an electoral system, which was a closed list proportional representation system. Basically, we vote for parties. Parties put together their lists of the candidates that they would want to represent them in Parliament in order of preference. And the reason why we call it a closed list is that the parties put together their own lists in whatever way they want to. There's no law that determines how they do that. And then we as voters were voting then for the party. And that's how we then got MPs and MPLs in the different legislatures. A group of people, the New Nation movement being the primary actor, brought something to the court to say, well, we should not have to join a political party in order to contest in an election at national or provincial level. Indeed, at local level, if you want to be a ward councillor, you don't need to join a party to be a ward councillor. You can run as an individual.
So, can I pause you there? Because I think people also don't realize that difference, right? That at national provincial level, only parties could contest. But that at local government level, you have a party list to get people into council chairs. But that the ward council list is actually of individuals, even if they are from parties, right?
Exactly. So at local level, in a local municipality, in the council, half of the seats in that council come from people who are elected from party lists. The other half of the seats come from people who are elected in wards as individuals. whether they are elected representing as individuals who represent a political party, or whether they are elected as individuals standing on their own, they are still individuals. It's individuals' names who are on the list, who are on the ballot at a ward level. And the posters.
And that's how we end up with
by-elections.
Yes. Because if that individual decides not to be a councillor anymore, resigns, passes away, then
at
the
a
party
ward
can't.
for a ward,
Yeah, at a ward level, then you have to run a new election in order to put somebody else then in that position. And so the court agreed with the New Nation movement and others that the Electoral Act of 1998, by requiring an individual to be part of a political party in order to stand for office, was a violation of Section 19 of the Constitution, which concerns political rights, and Section 18, which is about freedom of association. And so, but the Constitution is also very clear that the only entity that can make electoral law is Parliament. And so the court said the Electoral Act as it currently is unconstitutional. People should be able to contest for office without joining a political party. Parliament, you must fix it.
Asking the people that stand the most to gain or lose to decide the rules of the game, essentially.
And maybe before we go into how that change happened, because you've been elected through that kind of system before, Mbali, what do you think were the pros and cons of having a system like that, having this closed list system, and making people, forcing people to be part of parties? What's the consequence both for those elected, but particularly for the electorate, in your view?
So I think for those who are elected, if you only, have a closed list system, you actually make people more accountable to their party than to their constituents. It's a very obvious thing because my entire livelihood depends on whether in my party I can be put on a list at a certain position, and I must then listen to whatever the party does, to party lines. And even if I want to run something that is particular for wherever I come from in my constituency or my province, it's unlikely that if the party is against it that I can do it. And so you always then become somebody who has to do what the party wants before what the voter wants. And I think that this is also one of the issues of accountability that we have in the country. And then, of course, again, for the voters, you essentially vote for a political party, and you don't really know those people. You're hoping that the political party has done enough to put the right people in there. But as you've seen in South Africa, that isn't always necessarily the case. We have parties that have had people who have had very questionable histories and, are morally ambiguous in some senses. But what are you going to do as the voter? And you can't recall them, you can't do anything. So I think this is a step forward to where we need to be for accountability, both internally in parties and for voters. But as I'm sure Tessa's about to get into, there's still some complications around what this means. Certainly for me, I think having been a politician, there were definitely issues that I wanted to run, things like the legalization of marijuana, way before even Mario Ambrosini had gotten it through, which, at the party at the particular time didn't particularly like. Things like thinking about rent control in the city of Cape Town before we had digital nomads. Mm-hmm. These are all the kinds of issues that you could have run as an individual MP based on your constituents' needs or wants in a particular area that you couldn't do. Even things like learner transport, for example. My particular party at the time was very strong in the Western Cape, which is a very different geographic and even socioeconomic base to rural KZN, for example. So whatever the party's policy on learner transport was predominantly always for one part because that's who was strong, it didn't make sense where I was. But then you can't change it in that sort of sense. So you're constantly having these negotiations about things that we should actually not really be discussing. But yeah,
and I think that was always my issue, is that we actually vote for parliamentarians to go to work for us. And there's something about the system that hasn't really allowed them to work for us. So what system did Parliament come up with?
So the way that the election is going to work this year is that at the National Assembly level, we must think of the 400 seats in the National Assembly. as two different kinds of seats. 200 of the seats in the National Assembly are national seats that will be taken from the national party lists of different political parties. So the national ballot will only have political parties on it. And that National Assembly national ballot will be for the 200 seats that are reserved in Parliament, in the National Assembly, for political parties. Then 200 of the seats are regional seats. And this has always been the case, but it's been a behind-the-scenes kind of conversation. But one of the reasons why there was this division between the 200 national and the 200 regional seats, which is regional is provincial.
Provincial, yeah.
Was to ensure a nationally a representation of all provinces in the National Assembly.
Right, so that you make sure that the Northern Cape
So that you make sure that the Northern Cape has MPs from the Northern Cape that are in the National Assembly. Because otherwise, it would be very easy to have political parties to only submit lists of people from the big metros, from Gauteng, from Durban, from Western Cape, from Cape Town, not even, So to ensure that the National Assembly is nationally representative of all the different regions in the country, you've always had a system where 200 of the seats in the National Assembly were regional seats, where political parties would have to submit names of candidates that they wanted in those regional seats from the different provinces.
But we didn't have the ballot.
And we didn't have the ballot. It was a behind-the-scenes calculation that political parties did, and that the IEC then did after the election, when it was then time to turn the votes into seats to decide how many votes was going to mean how many seats. It was all a behind-the-scenes operation. Now that process is now out in the public domain. And so by that process, of the 200 regional seats, they are divided amongst the provinces, amongst the regions, according to the population size of that province. And so Gauteng, which has the largest population, has a larger chunk of those 200 seats. So this year, Gauteng has 48 seats allocated to it. KZN is the second largest province in terms of population, the second most populous province, has 41 seats allocated to it. The Free State has 11. The Western Cape, which is the third largest province in terms of population, has 23. No, the Western Cape is the fourth largest province. The Eastern Cape is the third largest province. It has 25. The Western Cape is the fourth largest province. It has 23. Next, you have Limpopo, which has 19. Then after Limpopo, you have Mpumalanga, which has 15. The Northwest has 13. The Free State has 11. And the Northern Cape, which is smallest in terms, is largest in size, smallest in population, has 5 seats. Now, in this election, every political party is going to submit regional seats that are divided in terms of each of the provinces. And independent candidates that want to contest can only contest for one of the regional seats.
Right. So they're only going to be on the
for one of
the two ballots.
They'll only be
so
independent candidates will only be on the regional ballot for the regional to national. Okay. Now the way that
provincial
or provincial, everybody. So in the provincial legislature, each of the provincial legislatures has a certain number of seats, and on the provincial ballot there will be the same number there'll be parties and individuals that are contesting for each of the provincial legislatures. And so what that means, that's important to say, is that each voters in different provinces will have one ballot that's the same, that's for the national to national seats, but then you'll have two ballots that are different. So Gauteng will have its own, the Western Cape will have its own, KZN, Free State, Limpopo, because it's not all of the same parties and it's not all of the same independent candidates that will be contesting for the regional to national seats in each province.
And in total, it'll be 19.
So there'll be 19 different ballots
that will be floating around across the country, but we will see 3.
Yeah. You as an individual will see 3. Cool. Okay. Now, the way that the election is then going to be calculated, so we all vote, and then we need to somehow turn those votes into seats allocate seats to parties according to the votes that they have gotten. Now, the way that the IEC does this, and it's going to be done in the same way this year, is that they use a formula, a quota formula. I'm taking you all back to maths, algebra, all of those things. Bear with me. It's actually just basic fractions. It's nothing more complicated. When did you learn fractions? Didn't we learn fractions in primary school?
I don't remember. I blocked it out.
It's basic fractions. Okay. So basically how it works is the total number of votes that are cast is divided by the total number of seats that are available. Okay? That whole number plus 1. And then you get a number and you disregard the fraction.
That's not a whole number.
That's not a whole number. And that is what you call your quota. And the quota is the number of votes required to get a seat. So in 2019, for example, where there were about 17 million voters for 400 seats in the National Assembly, the quota was about 43,000 votes that were required in order to get a seat in the National Assembly. Okay. Now, this year we'll be using the same quota, but the seats are going to be allocated in rounds. So, first off, a quota will be determined for the regional seats, for the regional to national list. So, for Gauteng, for example, which, as I've said, has 48 seats, it'll be the turnout. So, all the Gauteng voters divided by 48, which is the seats that are allocated to Gauteng, and that'll come out with a quota. In the previous election, that quota was 92,000 odd. In the previous election, the quota for the Northern Cape was 68,000. So that quota will then determine how many seats you need, how many votes you need to get a seat. And the first round of the allocation of the seats will be for each of the regional seats for independents. So all the independents that ran on the Gauteng regional to national ballot, that'll be calculated how many votes they have. So the number of votes that they have will be divided by the quota, and then you'll get a number of seats. If that seat number is equal to 1, then that independent candidate gets that 1 seat. If that seat number is less than, if that allocate is less than 1, so it's 0.7%, then they aren't allocated a seat immediately. All of the others are calculated. And if you have the highest remainder, so if you've got 0.85%, then...
And there's a seat available.
Or if you've got 0.85, not percent, 0.85, and there's a seat available, then you can get that seat.
So basically the whole country is going to be Bafana.
The whole country is going to be Bafana.
And so then there's that, World Cup
there's that process first to calculate the seats for the independents. If an independent candidate gets enough votes for 3 seats, they forfeit the other 2 seats.
They can't,
because you can't, you've got one bum with 2 cheeks that fits on one chair. You can't split yourself between 3 chairs. After the calculation has been done for the independent candidates, then you've got a calculation that is done for political parties. And the political parties' quota is then determined, the political party seats are then allocated according to the quota for that region.
And
then,
how many votes they got.
And how many votes they got. And then you've got the allocation of the National Assembly seats. Now, of the national list. Now, one of the challenges and one of the things that was challenged in court is that the allocation for the national list is out of 400. It's not out of 200 because they're thought of as compensating for overall proportionality.
So they have to work less hard, I guess.
So political parties that are only contesting on a national list
can only be on national.
Yes, but also the quota for them is divided by a larger number. It's divided by 400 seats, not 200 seats, is what you're saying.
Yes.
But then, yeah, that's your fault if you haven't given yourself 2 bites of the cherry when the legislation allows you to.
Yeah. So the quota for the allocation of the national seats is out of 400, not out of 200. So it's incredibly complicated. We're going to keep explaining it so that people will understand, hopefully, by the 29th of May. It's something that's going to need to keep being explained. We're going to put up pictures so that people can start to understand how this is done. But I think it's an important thing to start putting out there now already, because what we don't want is that on election day or the day after election, as the results are being calculated, that people are going to be confused and say, well, no, how did we get that?
Yeah,
how did we get here? And I think this is the thing about this new system, is that no one ever thought of this stuff before. You never had to think about the quota formula and how it's used, unless you were a politician in the political party. But now this is going to be something that is of interest to all of us, regardless of whether we are political contestants or voters.
And also, I mean, turnout is different every year. So it was 42,000 based on that turnout in the formula that they use. It can be different. And this is why you also can have people get seats on a remainder or on a fraction. So, for example, in KZN, if you got 17,000 something seats, you could technically get a seat in the legislature, all the way up until I think about 57,000, which is what the NFP got, and they also got a seat. So you had a lot of smaller parties that didn't even get a percent or whatever, but that's not what we look at. We look at the number of seats as per what's tested. So you can get a party that gets, a range of 17,000 to 50,000, and they all might still be eligible for one particular seat according to the formula.
Yeah. So the formula will be applied first to allocating seats for independent candidates.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That makes sense.
And then it'll be applied to the parties, and then for the regional to national, and then for parties for the national.
All right, so that gives them more of a fair shot.
So the idea
basically
is that the independents, in terms of the calculation, will get first bite. Look, it's still...
Yeah.
And a bit difficult thing to try, and I think for the independent candidates, just to give you an idea of what we are talking about, or how much it's going to take. I mean, in 2019, in order to get one of the regional seats for Gauteng in the National Assembly, you needed 92,000 votes.
92,000 votes in Gauteng. That's more than you needed for a national seat.
Exactly.
Almost by more than double.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so it's going to be a very, very difficult thing and expensive undertaking. And I think that it is, if we get one or two independent candidates in the National Assembly this year, it's going to be a lot.
Yeah.
And I mean, it does this complexity. It's starting to feel like we're going to a Bafana tournament and we're all going to have to be doing like serious math. But that's part of the reason why it's going to be so important that we pay attention, right? Because the parties are going to have to ask questions about, seats. Candidates are going to be asking questions about seats. So that leads me to a slightly different conversation in Mbali about voter observation.
Yeah.
And so you're going to be running a voter observation mission. What's the role of voter observers, even of party agents in this election? How do we make sure that the math is being done right? How do we make sure that nobody, is done wrong in this election? How do we make sure all of this works out?
So, I mean, we've always had observers, contrary to what some people have been popularly saying everywhere. And even international ones have come through the IEC every year. There's a process of how they apply and what they have to do to become observers. So that's absolutely fine. We've also always had local observers. It was usually church groups that would do it. I know the Cypher Council of Churches was big, sort of 94. Yes. We have, I think, decreased the amount of local observers just because the IEC has been very credible. But I think with this amount of contestation, it's been important for us to, again, just reset in terms of how we take part on the day. So obviously as GWC, we've said that we are doing independent observers. And we're asking people, instead of braaiing on election day, give a couple of hours to actually be there in the voting station. It's not as boring as people think it is. It's actually really exciting to watch the votes coming in and to be a part of protecting your democracy, doing something active. And the role really of party agents, first and foremost, is that they represent their party. They're there to make sure that anyone who might come in is assisted the way that they need to be assisted. Yeah. They can go and help the person. You get all kinds of different things. Obviously in 94, there may have been a lot of people that weren't particularly literate. So that was a big role that party agents played at that time. We don't have as much of an issue now, but parties like to have their people there to make sure that they're not screwed over on election day. But aside from the ANC, I don't think that there's another party in this country that can cover every single ward. And so it becomes important for us to be able, voters.
I was going to say there's 4,400 and something wards. So there's not enough parties parties don't have enough. And there's 23,303 voting stations.
So you need 23,000 warm bodies if you're a party that wants to have an agent in every station.
Yeah, which is unlikely. So this is where observers also become important. So observers, as opposed to party agents, don't take part in the actual let us vote view, but they're making sure that the party agents are behaving in the way that they should be. They can also, report on, did all the ballots arrive? Is there political tension? Is there violence? There's a whole checklist of things that even we will be training people on for the day to look out for and what they need to do. We've also got a very sophisticated system that feeds up to us so that we are able to also tell the IEC if for whatever reason, it hasn't been done from a local level. And it's a very complex, sort of thing that the IEC has to do to coordinate that amount of people, that amount of information. SAPS needs to know what's happening everywhere. It's very complex, which is why, if you can, be an extra pair of eyes on the day and make sure that we're protecting our election. And I think it's going to be very important with these newer parties, especially because they're not going to be everywhere. And if, some new party A gets 5 votes and, some really faraway place where they haven't even known that people were noticing them, to the point about today that a remainder 5 votes could make the difference.
Right. Every vote actually counts.
Every vote does count. You want to make sure that you have people there. So that's what's going to happen. But I did want to say also just a little bit, to go back very briefly to what Tessa was discussing about the independence and what's happened, is maybe for her to also touch on initially what the barriers were, why they went to court, how the signatures came about, because I know people in South Africa suddenly are very excited about, does a party have signatures or not? Why does it matter? It's the first time that is also happening in our country, that unrepresented parties needed to have signatures to contest. And then, I think that people might be interested how that came about and why it's suddenly a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important one, especially we're talking about voter observation on the day, but I think we have to observe this election end to end this year. And there's a lot of talk and a lot of questions about things like parties needing signatures in order to get onto the ballot. So right now, the IEC's put out that 115 parties have submitted their signatures to contest in the national elections. 16 independent candidates have submitted what they need to submit in terms of the 1,000 signatures.
Yes.
Signatures, and then there's a deposit that everybody needs to submit. So tell us a little bit about the signatures that need to be submitted by political parties. We know that parties that are already in Parliament or in the Legislature didn't have to submit those signatures. So as the Rivonia Circle, we participated in a court case. That's how the independent candidates don't have to submit the same number of signatures. But just tell us about, those signatures that need to be submitted, and how will we finally know who's on the ballot?
Okay. The compromise that was reached was that the signature requirement for political parties would be a proportion of the quota for the National Assembly as a whole, but then for the regional seats in the previous election in 2019.
So quota of the seat, the votes needed for a seat, or the votes needed to be part?
For a seat in Parliament.
And this is 15%.
And it's 15%. It was decided that you will need signatures equivalent to 15% of the quota that was required for a seat in the previous election. So as I was saying earlier, that Gauteng, the quota for a Gauteng regional seat in the National Assembly in 2019 was 92,601 votes.
So now you need 15%
So now
of that.
you need 15% of that if that's what you want to contest
So
for.
every province has different signatures.
As a party, what the Constitutional Court granted the Association of Independent Candidates went to the ConCourt, and they said it is completely unreasonable to expect an individual to collect that many seats, that many votes in order to be able to contest, and the ConCourt agreed with them. And so for independent candidates, there's a standard 1,000 signatures to contest at national or at provincial level. But for new parties, for unrepresented parties, so any party that is not one of the 14 that is represented in the National Assembly, they needed, regardless of when they were formed, so even an Action SA that was formed before the 2021 elections, or an AZAPO for that matter, regardless of when they were formed, an unrepresented party that wants to contest in the 2024 elections needs to get 15% of the quota for the region that they want to contest in. If you want to contest all regions, then you need 15% of the quota of the largest region from 2019. So, for example, if you want to contest in Gauteng, then you need to get the 15% of the 90. If you want to contest all 9 provinces, all 9 regions, so you are contesting Gauteng, then you need to get a quota that is equivalent to the number of that is equivalent for Gauteng, and not for anyone else, and not for any of the other provinces. And so it was quite a hefty requirement, because if you were then also going to be contesting the regional to national ballot, as well as all 9 provinces,
It gets hefty.
It
stacks up.
Yeah.
And so, I think also simply what it means for me is that the barrier is there, but for a new party, the chances are you don't have a lot of resources, you don't have a lot of money and time and people. So you are competing to be on the ballots against established parties which have made a very high threshold for you to come and actually encroach on what they might think is their turf. So I know, for example, in KZN, if you're an unrepresented party, you needed about 6,664 signatures to be able to contest. And that's a lot.
It's not just signatures, right? It's signatures.
It has to be it has to be registered people, signatures. And I mean, I don't know how the IEC is going to be able to check all 116. Well, I mean, I suppose maybe it's just like even half of those parties are new. That's a lot of signatures that the IEC has to then verify and check and see that the people that say that they got these signatures from voters actually did. I don't know what the process is. This is the first time. That's going to be interesting. How do you check that the person is registered? How do you check that they did actually sign? Because people could also just say that somebody signed. But I think it's good that we have a democracy that's maturing, that we're asking ourselves these questions, and even that, the IEC will have to get more robust in this if this continues to be the way that things are done. But for these elections, I think it's been an interesting span in the works. And obviously, we've seen some people that haven't been able to meet that particular signature requirement and so will not be on the ballots.
But the other thing that would make people not be on the ballot is candidates, right? So they have to also submit their candidate list and candidate signatures. So
I mean, if you don't even have candidates, I mean, I don't know if you...
So just what are the important dates we need to look out for in the next few months?
Oh, okay. Sorry. And I don't know if someone said something.
So the important dates, the 27th and the 28th of March, the IEC is going to make available at its regional offices the candidate lists of all the political parties that have submitted lists and that want to register and that have registered to contest in the 2024 election. So the list with the names of all of the candidates will be available at all of the regional offices and at the national office, as well as the names of all of the independent candidates will be available. And then people will be able to make objections to any of the candidates who are on the list on the basis of...
And you South Africans can also...
Yes, South Africans.
Everyone, if there are people there that that are on these lists that, I don't know, murdered someone and, something dodgy and shouldn't be there, you have just as much right. Don't leave it just up to the political parties because it's not in their interest sometimes to tell on each other. So this is where we also have to be very vigilant as citizens. Go through the list as much as possible. And if you see someone that shouldn't be there, then, raise the alarm.
Yes. And you can object. And that process will be open, though, only for 2 days.
Yes.
Only the 27th.
Is it going to be online?
It's not online.
No, you have to do it physically as well.
You have to physically go to
even for the voters' roll, if you want to play the voters' roll, you have to physically go.
So you physically have to go there, and this really should all be a digital system, but
sure.
It's
so
a huge undertaking
to go from province to province
to go and check.
On the 28th, which is my birthday on Thursday. So that's a very important date for sure. And then also you wanted to know about some other days. Sorry, I have to read them because the IEC's got a whole bunch of things happening that are going to be happening. So, the Tuesday, which is the 2nd of April, is when I think that the final commission will decide on the objections to the candidates and everything. So we'll know after that. And then... the cutoff of compilation of parties and finalists of who is then there after the objections will be done by the 10th of April. And then the IEC issue certificates to those individuals and to the parties to say, hey, say, you're registered, you're not insolvent, you're not a criminal, you can stand, and you're okay by the 12th of April. Then the only other ones that people should really look out for that are important to not get into too much nitty-gritty is if you're not going to be in your province on that particular day, or if you have to vote at a different place, you have until the 22nd of April to basically put that into the CEO of the IEC, but it's all on their website to say that you're going to be in a different place.
But that one's also really important for me because that one's also new, because it used to be that you could be, anywhere in the country.
But you'd only be able to do national, not your province. But now you can...
So is it that you need to be in your province or notify them if you're not going to be in your province, but you can still vote anywhere, or do you have to vote at your actual voting station?
You have to vote at your actual voting station, and you need to notify the IEC if you are unable to vote at your voting station, and you need to notify them by the 17th.
Because that's a big change.
It's a big change.
It is. Because you need to be at your voting station. Before, you used to be
able to, if you couldn't vote at your voting station, there was a form that you could complete that would then be added, submitted with all the information for that voting station. But now you have to vote at your voting station. And if you cannot, then you need to submit, let them know, let the IEC know. It's a big banner on the IEC website currently, so you should be able to see it by the 17th of May. If for whatever
everybody
reason,
must plan their calendars so that you're at your voting station on voting day.
Yes.
Yeah, so
That's serious.
Yeah, that is. And then also for special votes, you need to, this is usually more for political parties, but I'm sure there'll be civil society organizations that also want to know about that. Just to remember that also has to be an application that you do, and you say that, people are going to need special votes on that particular day. And then the only other one that I think is important is for people that are overseas, if they are watching, they are voting on different days to us. They actually vote on the 17th and 18th at their missions or their embassies, and people in different countries will just have to look up,
What their voting day is.
Yeah, which voting day is and what it is. And it seems that there are different times, so sort of 7 to 7 p.m. there as opposed to 9 p.m.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information going around. There is a lot to know. And part of the reason why I was like, we have to do this is because I think one of the concerns I have for this election is misinformation and disinformation. An election is only as good as the process is credible, as the process is trusted, as the process is known and accepted by everyone. If we don't accept the election, it doesn't matter, right? If we don't think that the thing was credible, then it doesn't matter that we've gone through the process. And so how do we make sure in the next 2 months or so that the credibility of this election is protected, that we don't allow either parties or people who have interest or even voters ourselves to start saying and doing things that give wrong information or misleading information that makes people not trust this election? Like, I think about one of the myths that I think has affected voter registration over time, the myth that if you register but you don't show up, that your vote then automatically is given to the biggest party. So I've heard this myth so many times. I heard it like yesterday at the Human Rights Festival, where people are like, is it true that if I don't show up, that I'm registered, my vote is just simply going to go to the biggest party?
No, it's not true. And can I please explain to people that the voter turnout is calculated as the number of people and votes that are cast out of the total number of registered voters. So if it were true that if you are a registered voter, your vote just gets given to the biggest party, then our voter turnout would always equal the number of registered voters. So if they were, like they were in 2019, there were 26,700,000 and something registered voters, but there were only 17 million that turned out to vote. If it was true that your votes get given, that the votes of the 9 million that didn't turn out
Just get handed
out like sweets, then the voter turnout calculation would be 26 million. But also, and most importantly, if you look at the political parties and what they got, the ANC got about 10 million out of the 17 million votes, which was about 57%. The DA got 3.6 million out of the 17 million votes.
So it's always out of the turnout.
And so it's always out of the turnout. If it was true that your votes were as a non-registered person, your vote was just being given to the ANC or just being given to the DA, then their share of the vote would be much bigger. The ANC would have gotten 15 million votes. So
I don't ever understand this argument.
This idea that it doesn't make sense for how the election is calculated, and I think that's why explaining how the votes are actually turned into seats is so important, even though it involves a whole lot of...
But it's mischievous parties that do it for, their base, to turn them out or to scare people, to say that, your votes won't count, your votes will count.
Much like parties, bigger parties say, don't vote for small parties because your vote is wasted.
Yeah, which
all
is
of that is
disinformation. It's politicking. It's got nothing to do with the maths of the day. And people should, if nothing else, just know that their votes count and they must go out and they must vote for the party that best does what they think they need in their communities. Yeah. Because this whole thing about imaginary votes being somewhere or not being somewhere is just not true.
So my rule of thumb when it comes to misinformation and disinformation for this election is that if a political party says somebody has wronged me, tell them, number one, show me evidence, and number two, go to court. Like, if a political party is saying we're being swindled, especially before the vote happens, and they're saying there's something wrong with the process. I mean, we're seeing now there are 2 court cases happening before this election. One is in the electoral court at the moment, the ANC case around MK. So you can take your issues to court. You can take your issues and put them into the public domain. Anybody who's not willing to do that is just trying to subvert the process. They're trying to lie to people. Do you have any other rules of thumb around disinformation, how people can just avoid?
Look, I think that everybody has the Electoral Code of Conduct came into effect on the day that the election was proclaimed. And if you see anything that is suspicious behavior, if you've seen anything on social media, report it to the IEC. That's what it's there for. And maybe we can put like a banner at the bottom of this to scroll with the details of where you reported to the IEC any violation of the Electoral Code of Conduct. You can report right up until the election and beyond. And then I think just looking at, I am a bit concerned that we're going to see like AI being used in weird ways and deep fakes and robocalls. We've already seen how the use of deep fakes, particularly in elections in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Indonesia, which just had its election last month. And so really being on the lookout for things that just seem
to be off.
And report anything that seems suspicious to the IEC. I think that the IEC is going to have to be much more vigilant and vocal about the implementing of the Code of Conduct. Everybody, every party and every independent candidate that will be contesting this election will have signed on to the Code of Conduct. Not signing the IEC's Code of Conduct is grounds for you to be removed from the contest. So all these parties have signed on to something that they have to abide by, and we as citizens have a responsibility to hold them accountable for that.
So, Mbali, this is going to be the first election in a while that you're going to be a voter and not a contestant of some kind.
Yeah, that is the right one too.
Yeah.
It's going to be so complicated.
It's madness.
But so now, from your perspective as a voter, how do you feel about this elections? How do you think it's going to turn out? What are the things that you're predicting will happen, even in terms of results, but also in terms of just the way it's going to play out?
I think this election is great. I like that there's more contestation. I like that there's heightened interest in what the processes are, because I think it can only move us further and into our democracy as we mature, so that more and more people start to engage with it beyond just voting. So I like that people are asking questions and they're confused and they want to know who the different actors are and why they're signatures. I think it's really great. And I think that it's a good case for civics to start becoming something that we just do all the time and the culture of our country, and not just before elections. In terms of the predictions, look, I'm from KZN, so we're a slightly different country there in terms of our politics and what's happening to the rest of the country. But I do see a lot of parties really gearing up for proper elections. So the MK, if they will be on the ballots, I don't know, we'll find that out at some stage when the electoral judgment comes out. The MK is looking quite strong in KZN, and I think that they might emerge, if not neck and neck with the ANC, very close to the ANC. I think the IFP will also probably hold steady for a while, although the MK does seem to be eating into them a bit. And then you've got a lot of smaller parties that are, I think, coming into their own. So I see Rise and Sansi a lot everywhere. Action Essays also quite strong. They got a strong leader there. And I think that the smaller parties may have taken maker roles. the Red Berets are going to come after me. I don't see them much in KZN, to be particularly honest. So I'd be interested to see how they're going to do in this election, because I haven't seen them be as prominent as before. So in KZN, I think we're going to have a coalition government of 3 or more political parties. Who are those 3 or more political parties is going to depend, I guess, on the 30th of May and the voters and who they decide to give that kind of power. And then nationally, I think the ANC will be below 50%. I'd say like 47, 48. I don't buy the polls that have them dipping by 2 digits at all. I get why other political parties are saying that about them, but I think people forget what a machine or a beast the ANC is when it has to really mobilize and get on the ground, especially those last 3 weeks. And again, as we said, they're the only ones that can practically be in every voting station. That means you have a presence everywhere in the country, and that comes up.
Predictions, thoughts, fears, concerns?
I don't like the predictions game because, it is really, a lot of it is just sucking out of your thumb. But I've got 3, maybe 4 things to say. The first is that I think that this is going to be the first election since 1994 where there's going to be very obvious regional differentiation or provincial differentiation. So what you're seeing happen in KZN and the dynamic in KZN is going to be very different to Gauteng, very different to the Western Cape, which has always been kind of the anomaly. I think that we're likely to see interesting things come out of the Free State, which people haven't really been focusing a lot to. And so I think that we're going to have much greater regional or provincial or variation between provinces than we've seen, certainly in the last 15, 20 years. And having said that, then I think that what's going to determine the where the ANC is, whether it gets over 50% or below 50%, I think is really going to be how it performs in KZN. KZN was responsible for 20% of the ANC's share of the vote in 2019.
What?
And Gauteng and KZN have the highest number of registered voters. So 20% of the ANC's vote share in 2019 came from KZN. So a dip in KZN has the potential to affect the ANC's national performance. And I think KZN more even than Gauteng, the ANC was already at about 50% in Gauteng already in 2019, and I think that it will fall below 50% in Gauteng. But KZN is this other kind of beast because the ANC has, since 2009, gotten a significant chunk of its national support from KZN. And so any dent on its support in KZN will have a national effect. Do I think that that effect is going to take the ANC dramatically below 50%? I don't think so. I think that the ANC is quite likely to hold on to like a 51, 52% even nationally. If it does dip below 50%, I think it'll go to like 47, 48. But this idea that the ANC is going to drop all the way to 40 or 42% nationally, 38%, does the numbers don't bear that out. Even if you were to use 2021 local government election as your baseline, and I usually don't agree in comparing local government to national and provincial election results. But yeah, so I think that the provincial differentiation is going to be important. The third thing that I want to say is that as somebody from Gauteng who lives in Gauteng, Gauteng is going to be a provincial government. It's going to be the Gauteng provincial government is going to be a coalition government. There's no single party in Gauteng that commands the support of over 50% of the population of Gauteng. And we've seen that very clearly in our local government, in our metros, particularly, but also in some of the smaller municipalities in the province. And no one seems to be talking about that. Like, what will a coalition government look like in Gauteng? Because it's a guarantee. Unless somebody comes out with something and gets over 50% of the population to vote for them,
Well, there's the difference, charters.
There and the charters and all the rest of it, but it is likely, highly likely, that it's going to be a coalition. And so who's going to go into coalition? Are we asking the parties, as Gauteng voters, are you asking the political parties, who will you go into coalition?
Actually, they're going to be more mature.
Yes, and are they going to be more mature?
And not just about titles, but actually about what can we do to get things working, as opposed to who gets to be a chairperson or a speaker.
And I'm quite sad that we haven't. What was the outcome of the deputy president's coalition endeavor? Where there was some, I think, quite good. There were some dodgy ones, but there were some good proposals around what processes must be followed to form a coalition government, etc. What's the outcome of those negotiations? Because we need to know what parties are going to be thinking about, who they're thinking about going to coalition with before we go into the election.
Especially the parties for themselves.
And they don't know.
They don't know. None of them are going to put their hand out to say, this is what we want to do, and so we're going to stick to it. Because they know on election day, if they're called to be like that little party that can be in government, then they want to maybe have that option available to them, which is why even with the multi-party charter thing, yes, they technically are working together, but if any one of them needs to help the ANC for stability or whatever, any one of them potentially could do that, or with other parties. And so you're right, we don't know, they don't know.
I find it bizarre that we're not having coalitions and how they're going to be formed, who's going to be, as a big conversation, because for some provinces, Gauteng certainly, KZN probably, we're going to have coalition governments.
And we don't have a lot of time for them.
Yes. And then the final thing is that I think that the big determinant of this election, as always, will be turnout. And I think that that's what's going to determine actually the performance of smaller parties.
Yeah.
Is going to be who turns out, and particularly do disgruntled voters, so people who've been on the voters roll for a long time but gave up on voting, do they turn out to vote for somebody else? And the second thing is, who do new voters vote for? And I find it extraordinary that we have, in all the crazy polls that we have seen, we haven't seen anyone poll new. We've got 1 million new registrations.
Again, it's not in the interest of political parties, because if they didn't register them, they assume that they'll go to somebody else and it's too much work. So they'll just keep speaking to their constituents and the people that they think they can rely on.
There are 1 million new people on the voters roll. Somebody out there, whoever likes doing polls, ask them, who are they going to vote for and why? As opposed to
switching and all of that.
Yeah, so voter registration is the big thing that I'll be watching out for.
So that's actually...
voter turnout, right?
That's
Do
actually...
you think it's going to be higher than previous elections, or do you think it's going to... I get the sense that it'll be higher slightly, just because I think there's so much more interest in this. But I have no data to,
Well, what we saw with the 2016 local government election, that was which was the most competitive local government election in terms of the number of participants, but also in terms of the conversation that was being generated around the election, is that the 2016 local government election had the highest turnout of any local government election that we've ever had. Then, of course, it rapidly dropped in 2021 for all sorts of factors. And so when there is a lot of debate around an election, when it seems like it's going to be a contested election, that there's very high levels of competition, that you often will have a higher turnout. Of course, that is going to be dependent on all of these administrative things and logistical things, like people knowing that they can't vote at their... that people knowing that they have to vote at their voting station, that if they can't vote at their voting station, they need to inform the IEC before the 17th of May. All of those things equal, that if all the logistical stuff holds, I think that we will see a higher turnout in this election.
And that's actually where my predictions come from. So for me, it's less of a prediction and more of a comment, right? That even, us scoffing at the idea of the ANC going as low as 40% in the polls, I actually think that's possible if we have extraordinarily high voter turnout and disgruntled voters come back and young voters come in. I think that makes everything unpredictable. I think the higher the turnout, the more unpredictable the outcome, and that should excite voters. I mean, voters should be stampeding to get to the polls if you really want to shake things up. only the voters can shake things up. So people are like, well, what's the factor? Which party is going to shake it up this year? I'm like, no, the voters can shake it up. So there are 43% of the voters' roll will be below the age of 35, will be between 18 and 35. And I think that's about 14 million voters or so. I think if those voters show up, I mean, what days you got 10 million votes to get 57%? If those voters show up, they can show all the parties' flames in a number of different ways. And then the other thing is about having a wider range of political parties. So I remember doing a calculation in 2019 that of the parties that contested at national level, there were 48 that contested, only 14 got in to Parliament. Those others counted for 500,000 votes. So I think there's going to be a lot of votes that are going to be spread out in a lot of ways. And even if those parties don't get into Parliament, it's going to have a big impact on the big parties and what share they actually get. So I'm excited about this because I'm predicting high voter turnout because I am encouraging people not to turn out because they're sure about which party they want to vote for and that party is going to do X, Y, and Z, but because I think we need to shake it up. And that's the way I see this election, the chance to shake it up. But thank you for this conversation. This has been really, really important to have. And I'm hopeful that we can get as much information out into the public so that we understand our vote. People know what happens with their X when they're going to put it down there, and that we can make this election as credible as possible because transparency is also about transparency in the process. So, yeah. Yeah.